January 9, 1993. A farm machinery dispersal sale on the outskirts of Alliance, Nebraska, 11 miles south of Highway 385. Pickup trucks sit nose to tail across a frozen stubble field, while a thin crust of old snow crunches beneath 200 pairs of boots. The thermometer reads 19 degrees Fahrenheit, but nobody seems eager to leave. Every farmer there has come hoping to find one piece of equipment that might survive another hard season. In the third row of machinery, past the disc harrows and a rust-bitten manure spreader, sits the item nobody wants to bid on, but everybody wants to stare at. A 10-inch grain auger built from 3 different decades of scrap. The flighting had been salvaged from a worn-out 1974 Westfield unit abandoned behind an implement dealer near Chapel, Nebraska. Its undercarriage rode on a differential pulled from a dead Ford F-350. A raw PTO shaft connected everything together, the exposed U-joint spinning barely 6 inches from where a man's boot would stand. The welds running along the main tube weren't pretty. Silver beads overlapped older gray welds, each pass revealing a man who had taught himself with patience instead of formal training. A neighbor named Wade Kessler leaned against his pickup with his arms crossed. He didn't bother lowering his voice. "That thing right there is a death trap." Several heads turned. The insurance company would drop you the minute they saw it. Laughter rolled through the crowd. Another man asked whether it was actually for sale. Wade answered before the owner could. Nobody in their right mind buys a lawsuit. The owner never looked up. Thomas Rourke simply shut the tailgate of his pickup, hitched the ugly homemade machine behind it, and hauled it home without saying a single word. He had heard worse. If you believe true resilience means building what you can't buy, tap subscribe, and tell me in the comments, what town or what country are you watching from? Thomas Rourke was 49 years old that winter, running 210 cow-calf pairs on a leased quarter section 8 miles west of Alliance in Box Butte County. The previous 3 years had been brutal. Feeder calf prices across the region had fallen from around $1.08 a pound in the fall of 1990 to barely 79 cents by late 1992. Every truckload he sold brought in less money, while the cost of feed, diesel, and veterinary care kept climbing. Then life delivered another blow. The previous spring, his wife had spent 6 weeks at Regional West Medical Center in Scottsbluff after a ruptured appendix developed into peritonitis. Even with insurance, the medical bills drained nearly $14,000 from a farm operation that never had $14,000 sitting around. His operating loan at the local bank was capped at $62,000 for the year. By early January, he had already borrowed $51,300 of it. Feed, fuel, medicine, repairs. The numbers left little room for hope. He had priced a new commercial grain and feed auger, a Westfield MK130-71 with a gas engine and swing hopper, at $18,500 installed. His remaining credit stood at only $10,700. He was $7,800 short before buying a single bolt. Worse still, spring calving was only 6 weeks away. Every remaining dollar would be needed for mineral supplements, vaccines, and overdue veterinary bills left over from the previous year's difficult calving season. Buying a new auger simply wasn't possible. So Thomas did what he'd been doing since he was 19 years old, working beside his father. He walked behind the old Quonset shed and started sorting through the scrap pile. Not everything there was junk. Years of repairing machinery had taught him that worn-out parts usually belonged in one of 3 categories. The first pile held pieces that still had real strength left in them, components that could safely carry weight or transfer power. The second held parts whose original purpose no longer mattered, but whose shape or gearing could be adapted into something completely different. The third was nothing more than steel, angle iron, channel stock, flat plate, material valuable only because it could hold everything else together. Among the first pile sat the heart of the entire project, a 10-inch Westfield flighting, old, weathered, lightly pitted, but still perfectly straight. Nearby lay 2 mismatched sprockets, salvaged from an old Baylor chain drive, and the Ford F-350 differential he intended to convert into a reduction gearbox, slowing the auger while multiplying its pulling force. Most people saw piles of rust. Thomas saw possibilities. There was one idea he kept returning to while laying every piece across the shop floor, Years later, his son would remember hearing it again and again. The most dangerous dependency on a farm isn't a bad market. It's a machine you can't repair when the supply chain freezes. Building an auger that actually moves feed instead of jamming solid isn't a matter of welding random pieces of steel together. It's a balance of torque, speed, and geometry. For nearly 3 weeks, Thomas spent every evening in an unheated pole shed. A single trouble light hung from a rafter, casting long shadows across the concrete floor, while a legal pad slowly filled with measurements, ratios, and rough sketches. Outside, Nebraska winter settled deeper into the countryside. Inside, every number had to be right. The first challenge was rotational speed. A standard 10-inch auger moving dry-shelled corn performs best somewhere around 350 to 400 revolutions per minute. At that speed, it moves grain efficiently, without placing unnecessary strain on the flighting. But Thomas wasn't planning to move dry corn. His cattle would be eating a heavier ration made up of high-moisture silage mixed with rolled barley, a sticky feed that behaved very differently. Run an auger too fast through wet material, and it doesn't increase productivity. It packs. The feed presses against the tube wall until the flighting can no longer move it. The drive stalls. Sometimes the shear pin breaks. Either way, the machine quits when you need it most. Run it too slowly, however, and the flighting can't clear itself between revolutions. Feed begins backing up at the intake until the entire system chokes. Thomas needed a balance. Starting with the 58 horsepower PTO on his old 1968 utility tractor, he worked backward through the gearing. The salvaged Ford differential would serve as a reduction gearbox, lowering the auger's operating speed to roughly 260 RPM. On paper, that sacrificed throughput. In reality, it bought him something much more valuable: torque. The slower speed gave the flighting enough twisting force to keep chewing through heavy, partially frozen feed, instead of stalling the moment resistance increased. He knew he would never move feed as quickly as the expensive commercial models. He only needed to move it reliably. The next problem involved the angle of the auger itself. A 10-inch auger normally uses 10-inch flighting pitch. The distance material advances with each revolution. Fortunately, the salvaged Westfield flighting already matched that standard, but the tube angle mattered just as much. Raise an auger much beyond 45 degrees and gravity begins stealing efficiency. The higher the angle, the harder the flighting must work, simply to keep material moving upward. Thomas designed a simple loading cradle that held the tube at roughly 30 degrees. It was steep enough to clear the sideboards of his feed truck, shallow enough to keep the feed flowing. Every decision favored reliability over speed. The final compromise was also the one everyone noticed first. Commercial augers came with enclosed PTO shields, protected shear pin housings, and guards covering every rotating component. Thomas's machine had none of them. The PTO shaft remained exposed. The U-joint turned in plain sight. The shear pin sat completely uncovered where it could easily be inspected, or accidentally touched. He knew exactly what people saw. They weren't wrong. Months earlier, he'd priced the proper shielding kits, $340, money he simply didn't have. So he made a choice that countless farmers before him had faced. He would never let anyone unfamiliar with the machine operate it. Every hired hand would be shown exactly where to stand, exactly where not to stand. Every operation would be deliberate. Every repair would be made with the tractor shut off. It wasn't ideal, but neither was trying to run a cattle operation without an auger at all. By the time the welding finally stopped, the legal pad held one last calculation. Total cost: $310 for bearings and replacement components, $185 for sprockets and chain, $95 for bolts and fasteners purchased a handful at a time from the local co-op. The remainder spent on welding rod, paint, grease, and fuel burned driving to 2 farm sales in search of one matching mounting bracket. Grand total, $1,140. Thomas looked across the page at another number he'd written days earlier. New commercial auger, $18,500. He drew one line beneath each figure. Then another. He never showed that page to anyone. But every time someone laughed at his homemade machine, he remembered exactly what those 2 numbers represented. Because there was a difference between building something cheaply and building something because you had no other choice. On January 24th, the weather changed. What had begun as another ordinary Nebraska winter system intensified as it crossed the Wyoming high country before colliding with moisture pushing north from the Gulf. By sunset, snow was falling so heavily that fence posts disappeared one by one. Through the night, the wind kept building. By morning, the National Weather Service station at Alliance Municipal Airport had recorded 32 inches of snowfall. Sustained winds topped 55 miles per hour, with gusts approaching 70. Wind chills plunged toward 40 below zero. Road crews quickly realized they were losing the fight. County plows became trapped in their own drifts. Telephone lines sagged beneath layers of ice. Visibility shrank to little more than the length of a pickup truck. Before the storm had even finished falling, Box Butte County declared a state of emergency. Thomas barely noticed. His attention was fixed on something far more important: his cattle. That winter, his herd wasn't gathered in one location. Part of it remained near the home place. The rest stood in a winter lot nearly a mile and a half away, separated by two section-line roads that had now vanished beneath drifts 4 and 5 feet deep. The cattle couldn't simply wait for the weather to improve. In temperatures like these, feed wasn't just nutrition, it was heat. Every mouthful became fuel for the animal's own metabolism, allowing it to maintain body temperature against the relentless cold. Without enough energy, even healthy cattle begin losing that battle frighteningly fast. Thomas didn't have time to hope someone would clear the roads. He had to find a way to reach them. Then, almost as if the storm wanted to prove a point, the machines everyone trusted began failing one after another. Several miles east of town, a transmission line collapsed beneath the weight of ice, cutting power to a neighboring operation whose electric feed system immediately went silent. Without electricity, their automated augers became nothing more than expensive steel. Back at Thomas's place, his newer loader tractor refused to cooperate. He climbed into the cab, turned the key, and listened. The starter groaned. The engine rolled over once, twice. Then the battery faded beneath the brutal cold. He tried again after warming it. Nothing. The machine that had made so many jobs easier throughout the year now sat motionless beside the barn. Expensive, modern, and completely useless. Thomas climbed back down without saying a word. He walked straight past it. Under the lean-to sat the old 1968 utility tractor. No electronics, no computers, no complicated systems to argue with. Just steel, fuel, compression, and 40 years of dependable service. The block heater had been plugged in overnight almost out of habit. Thomas climbed aboard, pulled the choke, turned the key. The engine coughed once, then settled into the familiar, uneven rumble he'd known for decades. He didn't smile. He simply backed toward the homemade auger. The hitch pin slid into place. The PTO shaft locked home. Snow whipped sideways across the yard as he eased the tractor into gear. The machine everyone had laughed at disappeared into the white. The wind hit hard enough to rock the tractor with every gust. Visibility came and went in waves. Sometimes Thomas could barely see the front of the auger. He refused to rush. Weeks earlier, while building the machine, he'd already decided how he would run it if conditions ever became this bad. Instead of filling the hopper to the top and risking a blockage, he fed the silage in smaller batches. Steady, controlled, patient. A flashlight clipped to his coat collar illuminated the chain drive just enough for him to watch its movement while listening to the engine. Years of farming had taught him something gauges never could. An experienced ear hears trouble before a machine shows it. The moment the engine's note deepened, he eased the feed slightly. The chain kept moving. The flighting kept turning. The homemade reduction gearbox did exactly what he had designed it to do. The slower rotation sacrificed speed, but every revolution delivered tremendous twisting force. Frozen clumps of silage that might have stopped a faster auger simply disappeared into the tube. The machine never hurried. It never panicked. It just kept working, hour after hour, lot after lot. Twice Thomas stopped to shovel drifted snow away from the intake. Once he shut everything down to tighten the drive chain after it began skipping beneath the load. Every maintenance stop followed the same routine. Engine off, PTO disengaged. Only then did his hands go anywhere near the machine. Nothing was left to chance. Nearly 9 hours after leaving the yard, he finished feeding the final group. By the following morning, every one of his 210 cow-calf pairs had eaten twice. Across the county, not everyone had been as fortunate. When the storm finally passed and extension agents began surveying the damage, several neighboring operations reported livestock losses after they were unable to keep feed moving through the worst of the blizzard. Thomas's herd came through without losing a single animal, not because he owned the newest equipment, not because luck had favored him, but because one homemade machine, dismissed as a dangerous pile of scrap only weeks earlier, had done exactly what he'd built it to do. The storm finally loosened its grip 10 days later. County graders pushed through the last of the drifting snow, reopening section roads 1 mile at a time. Telephone crews replaced broken poles. Neighbors who had spent days isolated finally began checking on one another. By then, word had already spread, not about Thomas, about the Auger, the ugly homemade machine everyone had laughed at. Late that afternoon, a familiar pickup rolled slowly into Thomas's yard. Wade Kessler stepped out, his boots crunching across the frozen gravel. Gone was the grin he'd worn at the machinery sale. He stood beside the Auger for a long moment, without saying anything. The machine looked exactly as it had 2 weeks earlier. The welds were still uneven, the paint was already scratched, the PTO shield still wasn't there. Nothing about it looked impressive. Finally, Wade broke the silence. "So," Thomas looked up from greasing the hitch, "I hear that thing never quit." Thomas shrugged. "It did what I built it to do." Another long silence settled between them. Then Wade asked the one question nobody at that machinery sale would have believed he'd ever ask. "Mind if I borrow it?" Thomas wiped the grease from his hands with an old shop rag. "What for?" "My feed system's still down." He looked away for a moment before adding quietly, "I've got silage backing up, and I need to get it moved before it freezes solid." Thomas studied him for a second. This was the same man who had called it a lawsuit, the same man who had laughed loud enough for everyone else to join in. Now he was standing in the same farmyard asking for help. Thomas could have reminded him, could have repeated every word from that sale, could have enjoyed the moment. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulled out the hitch pin, and handed it over. "Bring it back full of grease." Wade gave a short nod. "I will." No apology. None was needed. Some lessons arrive without words. That evening, after Wade drove away, Thomas walked back into the pole shed. The legal pad still lay on the workbench beneath a layer of welding dust. He opened it to the last page. At the bottom were the 2 figures he'd underlined weeks before. Homebuilt Auger, $1,140. New commercial unit, $18,500. Those numbers had mattered when he wrote them. They mattered a little less now, because the true value of the machine had never been measured in dollars. It had been measured in mornings, when cattle still had feed, in nights when calves survived another stretch of brutal cold, in knowing that when every comfortable solution disappeared, there was still one machine that answered when he needed it. People had looked at rough welds and exposed steel. They saw what it lacked. Thomas saw what it could do. And that was the difference. A tool built out of necessity will never win a beauty contest. It may never impress the neighbors. It may never appear in a dealership brochure. But when the world stops working the way it's supposed to, those are often the tools that keep working. The community called it a death trap while the sun was shining. The blizzard called it the only machine that never gave up. And long after the snow melted, people stopped talking about how ugly the Auger looked. They started talking about what it had saved. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe for more true-to-life farm stories where grit, ingenuity, and ordinary people overcome extraordinary challenges. And remember, sometimes the difference between junk and priceless is simply whether the hard times have arrived yet.